In the 1950s and 1970s, our grandmothers knew how to make one-pan meals that mattered. Their work in the kitchen didn't just cook dinner, they fried everything in one skillet, made gravy from the drippings, and fed the family without washing a stack of dishes. These 30 forgotten one-pan meals might sound too simple today, but they kept seniors fed. Let's rediscover what grandmothers cooked when one pan was all they had. Skillet fried chicken with potatoes wasn't Sunday dinner. It was supper when you needed protein and starch cooked together fast. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 30 minutes. Cut chicken into pieces, season with salt and pepper, fry in a cast-iron skillet with hot oil until golden and cooked through, remove the chicken and set aside, slice potatoes thin, fry them in the same chicken grease until crispy. The smell was fried chicken and crispy potatoes. The taste was savory, juicy chicken, golden potatoes, everything cooked in drippings. It cost about $1 in 1965, chicken at 50 cents per pound, potatoes from the bin, oil or lard for frying. This worked because chicken was cheap, potatoes kept for weeks, and the same pan cooked both. No separate pans, no oven, just one skillet. The meal stayed popular through the 1980s when fried chicken was still homemade. But for seniors living alone, skillet fried chicken with potatoes remained practical. It was warm, filling, and required one pan. But if chicken felt too heavy, what came next was lighter and used ground beef. Ground beef and cabbage skillet wasn't fancy cooking. It was supper when ground beef and cabbage were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 20 minutes. Brown 1 pound of ground beef in a skillet, drain the grease, chop half a head of cabbage into chunks, add it to the beef, stir, cover, cook until the cabbage wilted and softened. The smell was browned beef and cooked cabbage. The taste was simple, savory meat, soft cabbage, slightly sweet when cooked down. It cost about 70 cents in 1965, ground beef at 50 cents per pound, cabbage at 10 cents per head. This worked because ground beef was cheap, cabbage was cheap, and both cooked in one pan. No boiling water, no separate pots. Just brown, chop, add, cover. The meal stayed common through the 1970s when cabbage was a winter staple. But for seniors living alone, ground beef and cabbage skillet remained practical. It was warm, filling, and required one pan. But if ground beef felt too plain, what came next was richer and used liver. Before we move on, many of you asked in the comments where to find these recipes. We even received tons of email too, so we published these recipes on our website. The link is in the description. Let's continue. Pan-fried liver with onions wasn't gourmet. It was supper when you needed iron and protein fast. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 15 minutes. Slice liver thin, season with salt and pepper, slice onions thin, fry the onions in butter until soft and golden, push them aside, add the liver to the same pan, fry for 2 minutes per side until cooked through but not tough. The smell was rich liver and sweet onions. The taste was intense, earthy liver, caramelized onions, butter coating everything. It cost about 60 cents in 1955, liver at 30 cents per pound, onions from the bin, butter from the icebox. This worked because liver was cheap, onions were cheap, and both cooked in one pan. No separate cooking, no extra dishes. Just fry, flip, done. The meal stayed common through the 1960s when organ meats were still eaten regularly. But for seniors living alone, pan-fried liver with onions remained practical. It was fast, filling, and required one pan. But if liver felt too strong, what came next was milder and used ground beef. Salisbury steak with mushroom gravy wasn't restaurant food. It was supper when ground beef and canned mushrooms were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 20 minutes. Mix ground beef with breadcrumbs and an egg, shape into oval patties, fry in a skillet until browned, remove the patties, add canned mushrooms to the same pan, stir in flour to make a roux, add beef broth or water, stir until thick. Return the patties to the gravy. The smell was browned beef and mushroom gravy. The taste was rich. Savory patties, thick gravy, mushrooms adding earthiness. It cost about $1 in 1965. Ground beef at 50 cents per pound, canned mushrooms from the pantry, breadcrumbs from stale bread. This worked because ground beef was cheap, canned mushrooms kept forever, and everything cooked in one pan. No separate gravy pot, no extra dishes, just shape, fry, make gravy, done. The meal stayed popular through the 1980s when Salisbury steak was considered comfort food, but for seniors living alone, Salisbury steak with mushroom gravy remained practical. It was warm, filling, and required one pan. But if beef patties felt too heavy, what came next was smaller and used meatballs. Skillet meatballs in tomato sauce weren't Italian cooking. They were supper when ground beef and canned tomato sauce were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 25 minutes. Mix ground beef with breadcrumbs and an egg, roll into small meatballs, brown them in a skillet, pour canned tomato sauce over the top, cover, simmer for 15 minutes. The smell was browned beef and tomato. The taste was savory. Tender meatballs, tangy tomato sauce, slightly sweet. It cost about 80 cents in 1965, ground beef at 50 cents per pound, tomato sauce from the can, breadcrumbs from stale bread. This worked because ground beef was cheap, tomato sauce kept forever, and everything cooked in one pan. No separate boiling, no baking. Just roll, brown, simmer, done. The meal stayed popular through the 1980s when meatballs were served over spaghetti. But for seniors living alone, skillet meatballs in tomato sauce remained practical. They were warm, filling, and required one pan. But if meatballs felt too complicated, what came next was simpler and used sliced meat. The first 5 meals were fried in one pan: skillet fried chicken with potatoes, ground beef and cabbage, pan-fried liver with onions, Salisbury steak with mushroom gravy, and skillet meatballs in tomato sauce. But the next 5 go into sliced meats and breakfast classics: fried Bologna, ham steak, sausage with peppers, corned beef hash, and Spam with pineapple. Fried Bologna with pan-fried potatoes wasn't lunch meat. It was supper when Bologna and potatoes were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 20 minutes. Slice Bologna thick, cut a slit in the center so it didn't curl, fry in a skillet until the edges crisped, remove and set aside, slice potatoes thin, fry in the same Bologna grease until golden and crispy. The smell was fried Bologna and crispy potatoes. The taste was salty, smoky Bologna, golden potatoes, everything cooked in meat drippings. It cost about 50 cents in 1965, Bologna from the package, potatoes from the bin. This worked because Bologna was cheap, potatoes kept for weeks, and both cooked in one pan. No oven, no separate cooking, just slice, fry, done. The meal stayed common through the 1970s when Bologna was a pantry staple. But for seniors living alone, fried Bologna with pan-fried potatoes remained practical. It was fast, filling, and required one pan. But if Bologna felt too salty, what came next was richer and used ham. Ham steak with red-eye gravy wasn't fancy. It was supper when a thick slice of ham and coffee were all you needed. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 15 minutes. Fry a thick ham steak in a skillet until browned, remove and set aside, pour half a cup of black coffee into the same pan, scrape up the brown bits, let it boil and reduce into a thin, salty gravy, pour over the ham. The smell was fried ham and coffee. The taste was bold, salty ham, bitter coffee gravy, slightly sweet from the ham drippings. It cost about 60 cents in 1955. Ham steak from the butcher, leftover coffee from breakfast. This worked because ham was cheap, coffee was free, and everything cooked in one pan. No complicated sauces, no extra ingredients. Just fry, deglaze, done. The meal stayed regional in the South through the 1970s, where red-eye gravy was traditional. But for seniors living alone, ham steak with red-eye gravy remained practical. It was fast, filling, and required one pan. But if ham felt too salty, what came next was lighter and used sausage. Skillet sausage with peppers and onions wasn't Italian street food. It was supper when sausage links and vegetables were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 25 minutes. Brown sausage links in a skillet. Remove and slice bell peppers and onions. Fry them in the same sausage grease until soft and caramelized. Return the sliced sausage to the pan, stir, heat through. The smell was browned sausage and sweet peppers. The taste was savory, juicy sausage, and soft peppers, caramelized onions, everything cooked in drippings. It cost about 80 cents in 1965. Sausage from the butcher, peppers from the bin, onions from the crisper. This worked because sausage was cheap. Peppers were cheap in summer, and everything cooked in one pan. No separate cooking, no boiling. Just brown, slice, fry, done. The meal stayed popular through the 1980s at fairs and festivals, but for seniors living alone, skillet sausage with peppers and onions remained practical. It was warm, filling, and required one pan. But if sausage felt too greasy, what came next was drier and used canned meat. Corned beef hash, cooked in one pan, wasn't breakfast. It was supper when canned corned beef and potatoes were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 20 minutes. Open a can of corned beef, break it apart with a fork, dice potatoes small, fry them in a skillet with a little oil until they started to soften, add the corned beef, press everything flat, let it crisp on the bottom, flip sections with a spatula. The smell was browned potatoes and salty corned beef. The taste was savory, crispy hash, tender potatoes, salty meat throughout. It cost about 60 cents in 1965. Canned corned beef from the pantry, potatoes from the bin. This worked because canned corned beef lasted forever, potatoes kept for weeks, and everything cooked in one pan. No separate boiling, no multiple steps, just dice, fry, press, flip. The meal stayed common through the 1980s at diners and home kitchens, but for seniors living alone, corned beef hash cooked in one pan remained practical. It was fast, filling, and required one pan. But if corned beef felt too salty, what came next was sweeter, and used Spam. Fried Spam with pineapple slices wasn't Hawaiian cooking. It was supper when Spam and canned pineapple were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 15 minutes. Slice Spam thick. Fry in a skillet until the edges crisped and browned. Remove and set aside. Drain canned pineapple rings. Fry them in the same Spam grease until caramelized. Serve together. The smell was fried Spam and sweet pineapple. The taste was savory sweet, salty Spam, caramelized pineapple, both cooked in pork fat. It cost about 70 cents in 1965, Spam from the pantry, canned pineapple from the shelf. This worked because Spam lasted forever. Canned pineapple kept for years, and both cooked in one pan. No separate cooking, no extra ingredients. Just slice, fry, done. The meal stayed popular in Hawaii through the 1990s, where Spam remained a staple. But for seniors living alone, fried Spam with pineapple slices remained practical. It was fast, filling, and required one pan. But if Spam felt too processed, what came next was fresher and used fish. The first 10 meals were fried in one pan: chicken with potatoes, ground beef and cabbage, liver with onions, Salisbury steak, meatballs, fried Bologna, ham steak, sausage with peppers, corned beef hash, and Spam with pineapple. But the next 10 go deeper: catfish, chicken livers, cube steak, neckbones, Hamburger steak, pork cutlets, chicken thighs, salt pork, trout, and minute steak. Pan-fried catfish in bacon grease wasn't restaurant food. It was supper when fresh catfish and leftover bacon grease were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 20 minutes. Clean and gut-fresh catfish, cut into fillets or leave whole if small, season with salt and pepper. Dredge in cornmeal, fry in hot bacon grease in a cast-iron skillet until golden and crispy on both sides, the meat flaking easily with a fork. The smell was fried fish and smoky bacon. The taste was crispy: golden cornmeal crust, tender white fish, bacon flavor in every bite. It cost about 50 cents in 1965 if you caught the fish yourself, or 75 cents if you bought it from the market. Bacon grease was free, saved from breakfast and stored in a can by the stove. Cornmeal from the pantry cost pennies. This worked because catfish was plentiful in southern rivers and lakes. Bacon grease was never thrown away, and cornmeal was a kitchen staple. No breading station, no multiple bowls, just season, dredge, fry. Some families served it with hush puppies fried in the same grease, but plain catfish was more common. The meal stayed wildly popular in the South through the 1990s, where catfish fries were community events and Friday night traditions. But for most Americans outside the South, catfish was considered bottom feeder fish, muddy-tasting, bony, and undesirable. Younger generations preferred salmon or tilapia. But for seniors living alone, pan-fried catfish in bacon grease remained practical. It was fast, filling, and required one pan. The bacon grease made the fish taste rich and smoky, and the cornmeal crust stayed crispy even after cooling. By the 2000s, health concerns about fried foods and saturated fats made bacon grease less popular. But during the 1960s and 70s, pan-fried catfish in bacon grease was a practical one-pan meal that cost almost nothing if you caught your own fish. But if catfish felt too bony, what came next was softer and used chicken livers. Skillet chicken livers with onions weren't appetizers. They were supper when organ meats were cheaper than regular chicken. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 15 minutes. Rinse chicken livers and pat dry. Slice onions thin. Fry the onions in butter until soft and golden. Push them aside. Add the chicken livers to the same pan. Season with salt and pepper. Fry for 3 to 4 minutes per side until browned outside but still slightly pink inside. The smell was rich liver and sweet onions. The taste was intense: earthy livers, caramelized onions, butter coating everything. It cost about 40 cents in 1955, chicken livers at 20 cents per pound, onions from the bin, butter from the icebox. This worked because chicken livers were the cheapest part of the chicken, Onions were cheap, and both cooked in one pan in under 15 minutes. No complicated prep, no long cooking, just rinse, slice, fry. Some families added bacon instead of butter for extra flavor, or splashed vinegar in the pan at the end to deglaze, but plain liver and onions was more common. The meal stayed common through the 1960s when organ meats were still eaten regularly. Children resisted them because the texture was soft and the flavor was strong, but adults appreciated them because they were cheap and rich in iron. Pregnant women and anemic seniors were told to eat liver weekly for health. By the 1970s, chicken livers started disappearing from everyday tables as boneless chicken breasts became affordable and popular. By the 1980s, most Americans considered chicken livers poverty food or soul food, something eaten only in the South or by older generations who grew up during the Depression. But during the 1950s and 60s, skillet chicken livers with onions were a practical one-pan meal that delivered protein and iron for less than 50 cents. But if chicken livers felt too soft, what came next was tougher and used cube steak. Cube steak with country gravy wasn't fancy dining. It was supper when cheap beef and flour were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 20 minutes. Season cube steak with salt and pepper, dredge in flour, fry in a hot skillet with oil until browned and crispy on both sides. Remove the steak and set aside. Add a spoonful of flour to the same pan. Stir into the drippings to make a roux. Pour in milk slowly while stirring. Cook until thick and creamy. Pour over the steak. The smell was fried beef and milk gravy. The taste was rich, crispy steak, thick white gravy, black pepper sharpness. It cost about 90 cents in 1965. Cube steak at 60 cents per pound, flour from the pantry, milk from the bottle. This worked because cube steak was one of the cheapest cuts of beef. Flour was a staple, and milk was always on hand. No separate gravy pot. No extra dishes, just dredge, fry, make gravy in the same pan. Some families served it with mashed potatoes or biscuits to soak up the gravy, but plain cube steak and gravy was a complete meal. The meal stayed wildly popular in the South and Midwest through the 1990s, where it was called chicken fried steak, even though it was beef. Diners served it on blue plate specials, and home cooks made it on busy weeknights. The cube steak was mechanically tenderized, pounded with a meat mallet that left cube-shaped indentations, which made cheap, tough beef tender enough to chew. By the 2000s, cube steak became less common as boneless chicken and ground beef took over. But during the 1960s and 70s, cube steak with country gravy was a practical one-pan meal that turned cheap beef into something tender and flavorful. But if cube steak felt too tough, what came next was softer and used neck bones. Skillet neck bones with potatoes weren't soul food. They were supper when neck bones were cheaper than regular pork. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 40 minutes. Brown pork neck bones in a skillet, add sliced potatoes, pour in enough water to half cover everything, season with salt and pepper, cover with a lid, simmer on low heat until the meat was tender and falling off the bone. The smell was pork and soft potatoes. The taste was rich, fatty pork, tender potatoes, broth from the simmering. It cost about 60 cents in 1955, neck bones at 15 cents per pound, potatoes from the bin. This worked because neck bones were one of the cheapest cuts of pork. Potatoes were cheap and both cooked in one pan. No separate boiling, no roasting. Just brown, add simmer. Some families added onions or cabbage to the pot, but plain neck bones and potatoes was more common. The meat was fatty and required gnawing, but it was flavorful and filling. The meal stayed common in black communities and rural areas through the 1970s, where neckbones were a staple of Sunday dinners and weeknight suppers. But for most Americans, neckbones were considered scrap meat, something you gave to dogs or threw away. Younger generations preferred boneless pork chops or ham. By the 1980s, neckbones had mostly disappeared from grocery store meat counters, except in neighborhoods with older populations. By the 1990s, neckbones were sold frozen in bulk packages and considered poverty food, but during the 1950s and 60s, skillet neckbones with potatoes were a practical one-pan meal that turned cheap pork scraps into something tender and satisfying. But if neckbones felt too bony, what came next was smoother and used ground beef shaped into patties. Hamburger steak with onion gravy wasn't a burger. It was supper when ground beef and onions were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 20 minutes. Mix ground beef with salt and pepper, shape into thick oval patties. Fry in a skillet until browned on both sides. Remove and set aside. Slice onions thin. Fry them in the same beef grease until soft and caramelized. Sprinkle flour over the onions. Stir to make a roux. Add beef broth or water slowly. Stir until thick. Return the patties to the gravy. The smell was browned beef and caramelized onions, and the taste was savory, juicy beef patties, thick onion gravy, slightly sweet. It cost about 80 cents in 1965, ground beef at 50 cents per pound, onions from the bin, flour from the pantry. This worked because ground beef was cheap, onions were cheap, and everything cooked in one pan. No buns, no toppings, no separate gravy pot. Just shape, fry, make gravy, done. Some families served it with mashed potatoes or rice to soak up the gravy, but plain hamburger steak was a complete meal. The meal stayed wildly popular through the 1980s at diners and home kitchens, where it was called Salisbury steak in restaurants, but hamburger steak at home. The difference was marketing. Salisbury steak sounded fancier. By the 1990s, frozen Salisbury steak TV dinners replaced homemade versions, and younger generations stopped making hamburger steak from scratch. By the 2000s, hamburger steak had mostly disappeared from everyday tables, but during the 1960s and 70s, hamburger steak with onion gravy was a practical one-pan meal that turned cheap ground beef into something rich and satisfying. But if ground beef felt too plain, what came next was fancier and used pork tenderloin. The first 15 meals were fried in one pan: catfish in bacon grease, chicken livers with onions, cube steak with country gravy, neck bones with potatoes, hamburger steak with onion gravy, pork tenderloin cutlets, chicken thighs with canned vegetables, salt pork with cream gravy, trout with butter, and minute steak with onions. But the next 5 go into simpler territory: hot dogs with pork and beans, fried mush, eggs and potatoes, chicken and rice, and gizzards with onions. Pan-fried pork tenderloin cutlets weren't schnitzel. They were supper when pork tenderloin and breadcrumbs were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 20 minutes. Slice pork, tenderloin thin, pound the slices flat with a meat mallet, season with salt and pepper, dredge in flour, dip in beaten egg, coat in breadcrumbs, fry in hot oil in a skillet until golden and crispy on both sides. The smell was fried pork and toasted breadcrumbs. The taste was crispy: golden crust, tender pork, juicy inside. It cost about $1 in 1965, pork tenderloin at 70 cents per pound, breadcrumbs from stale bread, egg from the carton. This worked because pork tenderloin was affordable, breadcrumbs were free, and everything cooked in one pan. No oven, no multiple steps, just slice, pound, dredge, fry. Some families made pan gravy from the drippings by adding flour and milk, but plain cutlets were more common. The pork was tender and mild, and the breading stayed crispy. The pork was tender and mild, and the breading stayed crispy. The meal stayed regional in the Midwest through the 1980s, where pork tenderloin sandwiches were served at diners on oversized buns. But for most Americans, breaded pork cutlets were considered German or Eastern European food, something ethnic families ate but not mainstream. By the 1990s, boneless pork chops replaced tenderloin cutlets, and younger generations stopped pounding meat flat. By the 2000s, pan-fried pork tenderloin cutlets had mostly disappeared from home kitchens except in Indiana and Iowa, where they remained a regional specialty. But during the 1960s and 70s, pan-fried pork tenderloin cutlets were a practical one-pan meal that turned affordable pork into something crispy and satisfying. But if pork cutlets felt too fancy, what came next was simpler and used chicken thighs. Skillet. Chicken thighs with canned vegetables weren't gourmet cooking. They were supper when chicken thighs and canned vegetables were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 30 minutes. Season chicken thighs with salt and pepper, brown them skin side down in a skillet, flip and brown the other side, push the chicken aside, open a can of mixed vegetables, drain and add them to the same pan, stir to coat in the chicken drippings, cover with a lid, simmer for 15 minutes until the chicken was cooked through. The smell was roasted chicken and soft vegetables. The taste was savory, juicy chicken, tender vegetables, everything coated in drippings. It cost about $1 in 1965. Chicken thighs at 40 cents per pound, canned mixed vegetables from the pantry. This worked because chicken thighs were cheaper than breasts. Canned vegetables lasted forever, and both cooked in one pan. No separate roasting, no boiling vegetables, just brown. Add, simmer. Some families used canned green beans or corn instead of mixed vegetables, but the process was the same. The meal stayed common through the 1980s when canned vegetables were still a pantry staple. Fried salt pork with cream gravy wasn't bacon. It was supper when salt pork and milk were all you had. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 20 minutes. Slice salt pork thin, soak in water for 10 minutes to reduce the saltiness, pat dry, fry in a skillet until crispy and browned, remove and set aside, pour off most of the grease, but leave a spoonful. Add flour to the pan and stir to make a roux. Pour in milk slowly while stirring. Cook until thick and creamy. Pour over the salt pork. The smell was fried pork and milk gravy. The taste was salty. Crispy pork, rich white gravy, black pepper sharpness. It cost about 50 cents in 1955. Salt pork from the butcher, milk from the bottle, flour from the pantry. This worked because salt pork was one of the cheapest preserved meats. Milk was always on hand, and flour was a staple. No refrigeration needed for salt pork. It was cured and kept at room temperature. No separate gravy pot, just fry. Make gravy in the same pan. Some families served it with biscuits or grits to soak up the gravy, but plain salt pork was a complete meal. Skillet trout with butter and bacon drippings wasn't restaurant food. It was supper when you caught fresh trout and had bacon grease saved. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 15 minutes. Clean and gut fresh trout, leave whole or fillet, season with salt and pepper, dust lightly with flour, and fry in a mixture of butter and bacon, drippings in a hot skillet until golden and crispy on both sides, the flesh flaking easily. The smell was fried fish and smoky bacon. The taste was delicate, tender trout, crispy skin, butter and bacon flavor throughout. It cost nothing in 1965 if you caught the fish yourself, or about 60 cents if you bought it from the market. Butter and bacon drippings were pantry staples. Flour cost pennies. This worked because trout was plentiful in mountain streams and stocked lakes, bacon grease was saved from breakfast, and butter added richness. No breading, no complicated prep. Just clean, season, fry. Some families squeezed lemon over the fish at the end. Pan-fried minute steak with onions wasn't gourmet. It was supper when thin-cut beef and onions were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 15 minutes. Season thin-cut minute steaks with salt and pepper, fry in a hot skillet for 1 minute per side until browned. Remove and set aside. Slice onions thin. Fry them in the same beef grease until soft and caramelized. Return the steaks to the pan, heat through. The smell was browned beef and sweet onions. The taste was savory, thin steaks, caramelized onions, beef drippings coating everything. It cost about $1 in 1965, minute steaks at 70 cents per pound, onions from the bin. This worked because minute steaks were thin-cut and cooked fast, onions were cheap, and both cooked in one pan in under 15 minutes. No marinating, no tenderizing. Just season, fry, done. Some families made pan gravy by adding flour and water to the onions, but plain steak and onions was more common. The first 20 meals were fried in one pan: chicken, ground beef, liver, Salisbury steak, meatballs, Bologna, a ham steak, sausage, corned beef hash, Spam, catfish, chicken livers, cube steak, neck bones, Hamburger steak, pork cutlets, chicken thighs, salt pork, trout, and minute steak. But the final 10 go into the forgotten territory: hot dogs with beans, fried mush, eggs and potatoes, chicken and rice, gizzards, rabbit, oxtails, pinto beans, Bologna and eggs, and potatoes in bacon fat. Skillet hot dogs with pork and beans wasn't camping food. It was supper when hot dogs and canned beans were all you had left in the pantry. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 15 minutes. Slice hot dogs into thick rounds. Fry them in a skillet until the edges browned and crisped. Open a can of pork and beans. Pour them over the hot dogs in the same pan. Stir to combine. Heat until the beans were bubbling. The smell was smoky hot dogs and sweet beans. The taste was simple: salty hot dogs, thick bean sauce, slightly sweet from molasses. It cost about 60 cents in 1965. Hot dogs from the package, canned pork and beans from the pantry. This worked because hot dogs lasted a week in the icebox. Canned beans stacked on the shelf for years, and both cooked together in one pan in under 15 minutes. No boiling water, no separate pots, just slice, fry, pour, heat. Some families added a spoonful of mustard or ketchup to the beans for extra flavor, or sprinkled shredded cheese on top before serving, but plain hot dogs and beans was more common. The meal stayed wildly popular through the 1980s, when hot dogs and beans were considered kid-friendly comfort food. Children loved it because hot dogs tasted familiar and beans were soft and sweet. So adults appreciated it because it was cheap, fast, and required no thought. Fried mush, crisped in butter, wasn't breakfast. It was supper when leftover cornmeal, mush, and butter were all you had. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 20 minutes. Cook cornmeal mush the day before by boiling cornmeal in salted water until thick. Pour it into a loaf pan. Refrigerate overnight until firm. Slice the cold mush into half-inch slices. Fry in hot butter in a skillet until golden and crispy on both sides. The smell was toasted cornmeal and browned butter. The taste was crispy outside, soft inside, golden crust, tender cornmeal center, butter coating everything. It cost about 30 cents in 1955. Cornmeal from the pantry, butter from the icebox. This worked because cornmeal was one of the cheapest grains. Leftover mush kept for days in the icebox, and frying in butter made it taste rich. No eggs, no flour, no complicated prep. Just slice cold mush and fry. Some families drizzled maple syrup or molasses over the fried mush to make it sweet, while others served it with sausage gravy or fried eggs to make it savory. But plain fried mush with butter was more common. The meal stayed regional through the 1970s in Appalachia, the Midwest, and rural areas where cornmeal was a staple. Skillet eggs and potatoes wasn't breakfast, it was supper when eggs and potatoes were all you had left. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 25 minutes. Dice potatoes small, fry them in oil or bacon grease in a skillet until golden and crispy, season with salt and pepper, push the potatoes to the side, crack eggs directly into the same pan, fry until the whites set and the yolks stayed runny, serve together. The smell was fried potatoes and eggs. The taste was simple, crispy potatoes, runny yolks, everything cooked in the same grease. It cost about 40 cents in 1965, potatoes from the bin, eggs from the carton, oil or bacon grease from the stove. This worked because potatoes kept for weeks, eggs lasted for weeks in the icebox, and both cooked in one pan. No separate cooking, no boiling water, just dice, fry, crack, done. Some families added diced onions or peppers to the potatoes or crumbled bacon on top, but plain eggs and potatoes was more common. The runny yolks mixed with the crispy potatoes, creating a rich, creamy sauce. The meal stayed wildly popular through the 1990s at diners and home kitchens, where it was served for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Hash browns with eggs became a diner staple, and home cooks made it on busy weeknights when they needed something fast. Children loved it because eggs and potatoes were familiar and comforting. Adults appreciated it because it was cheap, filling, and required minimal effort. By the 2000s, pre-shredded hash browns and egg substitutes made the meal even faster, but homemade versions started feeling old-fashioned. Younger generations preferred breakfast burritos or avocado toast. But during the 1960s and 70s, skillet eggs and potatoes were a practical one-pan meal that cost less than 50 cents. One-pan chicken and rice wasn't fancy cooking. It was supper when chicken and rice were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 40 minutes. Season chicken pieces with salt and pepper, brown them in a skillet, remove and set aside, add uncooked rice to the same pan, stir to coat in the chicken drippings, pour in chicken broth or water, return the chicken to the pan on top of the rice. Cover with a lid, simmer for 25 minutes until the rice absorbed the liquid and the chicken was cooked through. The smell was roasted chicken and steamed rice. The taste was savory. Juicy chicken, fluffy rice, everything coated in drippings. It cost about $1.20 in 1965, chicken at 50 cents per pound, rice from the pantry, chicken broth from the can, or made from bouillon cubes. This worked because chicken was cheap, rice was cheap, and both cooked together in one pan. No separate pots, no oven, just brown, add, simmer. Some families added canned vegetables or frozen peas during the last 5 minutes of cooking, but plain chicken and rice was more common. The meal stayed wildly popular through the 1990s in households around the world. Spanish arroz con pollo, southern chicken and rice, Asian chicken rice bowls. But the basic method remained the same. Brown chicken, cook rice in the drippings, simmer together. By the 2000s, pre-cooked rotisserie chickens and instant rice made the meal even faster, but cooking it from scratch in one pan became less common. By the 2000s and 10s, one-pan chicken and rice recipes went viral on social media, all rebranded as easy weeknight dinners and minimal cleanup meals. Food bloggers added garlic, lemon, herbs, and white wine, turning the simple Depression-era meal into something trendy. But during the 1960s and 70s, one-pan chicken and rice was a practical meal that cost just over $1. Pan-fried gizzards with onions weren't appetizers. They were supper when organ meats were cheaper than regular chicken. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 40 minutes. Rinse chicken gizzards and trim off any excess fat. Boil them in salted water for 20 minutes until tender. Drain and slice thick. Slice onions thin. Fry the onions in butter or bacon grease until soft and golden. Add the sliced gizzards to the same pan. Season with salt and pepper. Fry until browned and crispy on the edges. The smell was fried onions and chicken. The taste was chewy. Firm gizzards, sweet onions, butter coating everything. It cost about 40 cents in 1965. Chicken gizzards at 20 cents per pound. Onions from the bin, butter from the icebox. This worked because gizzards were the cheapest part of the chicken. Onions were cheap and both cooked in one pan after boiling. No complicated prep. No expensive ingredients. Just boil, slice, fry. Some families added mushrooms or peppers to the pan, or made gravy from the drippings, but plain gizzards and onions was more common. The meal stayed regional through the 1980s in the South and among immigrant communities where organ meats remained common. But for most Americans, gizzards were considered poverty food or soul food, something you ate only if you couldn't afford boneless chicken breasts. Children resisted them because the texture was chewy and rubbery, like eating pencil erasers. Adults who grew up eating them appreciated the firm bite and rich flavor, but younger generations refused to try them. By the 1990s, chicken gizzards had mostly disappeared from grocery store meat counters, except in areas with large Black or Southern populations. Fast food restaurants occasionally offered fried gizzards as a regional specialty, but home-cooked gizzards became rare. By the 2000s, gizzards were considered exotic or ethnic, something you ordered at a Korean restaurant or bought at an Asian grocery store, not something you cooked at home. But during the 1960s and 70s, pan-fried gizzards with onions were a practical one-pan meal that turned cheap organ meat into something edible. The first 25 meals were fried in one pan: chicken, beef, liver, Bologna, ham, sausage, catfish, cube steak, hot dogs with beans, fried mush, eggs and potatoes, chicken and rice, and gizzards. But the final 5 go into survival territory. Oxtail pieces, pinto beans with fatback, Bologna and eggs, and potatoes in bacon fat. Skillet fried rabbit wasn't wild game hunting. It was supper when you raised rabbits in the backyard or bought them from a neighbor. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 40 minutes. Clean and cut rabbit into pieces, soak in salted water for 10 minutes to remove any gamey taste, pat dry, season with salt and pepper, dredge in flour, fry in hot oil or lard in a cast-iron skillet until golden and cooked through, about 8 minutes per side. The smell was fried meat and toasted flour. The taste was mild, tender white meat, crispy coating, similar to chicken, but slightly sweeter. It cost about 50 cents in 1955 if you raised your own rabbits, or 75 cents if you bought them from a farm. Flour from the pantry cost pennies. Oil or lard was saved and reused. This worked because rabbits bred quickly and required minimal feed: vegetable scraps, garden greens, and hay. One rabbit could feed a family of 4. No refrigeration needed until butchering. Just raise, butcher, fry. Some families made gravy from the drippings by adding flour and milk, but plain fried rabbit was more common. The meal stayed common in rural areas through the 1970s, especially in Appalachia and the South, where backyard rabbits were a protein source during hard times. But for most Americans, rabbit was considered poverty food or ethnic food, something Italians and French people ate, not mainstream Americans. By the 1980s, commercial chicken became so cheap that raising rabbits for meat no longer made economic sense. By the 1990s, rabbit had mostly disappeared from American tables, except at high-end restaurants where it was served braised or roasted with wine sauce and charged at premium prices. Younger generations found the idea of eating rabbit disturbing. Rabbits were pets, not food. But during the 1950s and 60s, skillet fried rabbit was a practical one-pan meal that cost almost nothing if you raised your own. The meat was lean and mild, similar to chicken but with a finer grain. The legs and saddle were meatiest, the front legs were bony. Pan-fried oxtail pieces weren't stew meat. They were supper when oxtails were cheaper than regular beef. Seniors in the 1950s made this meal in under 50 minutes. Cut oxtails into sections, if not pre-cut, season with salt and pepper, dredge in flour, brown in hot oil in a skillet until deeply browned on all sides, add sliced onions to the same pan, pour in enough water to half cover the oxtails, cover with a lid, simmer on low heat for 40 minutes until the meat was tender and falling off the bone. The smell was rich beef and caramelized onions. The taste was deep, fatty oxtail, thick broth, tender meat that pulled apart easily. It cost about 60 cents in 1955, oxtails at 20 cents per pound, onions from the bin, flour from the pantry. This worked because oxtails were considered scrap meat, cheap, fatty, and bony, but full of flavor. Onions added sweetness, flour thickened the broth into gravy, and simmering made the tough meat tender. No separate pots, no roasting, just brown, add, simmer. Some families added potatoes or carrots during the last 20 minutes, but plain oxtail and onions was more common. The meal stayed regional through the 1970s in black communities and immigrant households where oxtail soup and oxtail stew were traditional dishes. But for most Americans, oxtails were considered poverty food or ethnic food, something Jamaicans, Koreans, and Southern cooks ate, not mainstream fare. By the 1980s, oxtails started appearing at soul food restaurants and Caribbean takeout spots, but home-cooked oxtails remained rare. By the 1990s, oxtails became trendy as chefs discovered their rich, beefy flavor and gelatinous texture. Suddenly, oxtails were expensive, $5 per pound or more, and appeared on upscale restaurant menus braised in wine or slow-cooked for hours. But during the 1950s and 60s, pan-fried oxtail pieces were a practical one-pan meal that cost less than $1. The meat was fatty and rich, requiring gnawing and sucking to get every bit off the bone. Skillet pinto beans with fatback wasn't a side dish. It was supper when dried beans and salt pork were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal the day before. Soak dried pinto beans overnight in water, drain, slice fatback, salt pork, into thick pieces, fry in a skillet until some fat rendered out, add the soaked beans to the same pan, cover with water, season with salt and pepper, bring to a boil, reduce to a simmer, cover with a lid, cook for 2 to 3 hours until the beans were tender and the liquid thickened into gravy. The smell was pork and earthy beans. The taste was rich, creamy beans, salty fatback, thick bean liquor. It cost about 40 cents in 1965. Dried pinto beans from the bulk bin, fatback from the butcher. This worked because dried beans lasted forever. Fatback was cheap preserved pork, and both cooked together in one pan over low heat. No separate pots, no baking, just soak, fry, add, simmer. Some families added diced onions or a bay leaf to the beans, but plain pinto beans and fatback was more common. The fatback melted into the beans, flavoring the liquid and adding fat. The meal stayed wildly popular in the South, Appalachia, and rural areas through the 1980s, where beans and cornbread was a classic supper. But for most Americans, dried beans were considered poverty food or time-consuming. Why soak and cook beans for hours when you could open a can? By the 1990s, canned beans replaced dried beans in most kitchens, and fatback became hard to find except in specialty butcher shops. By the 2000s, dried beans became trendy again as slow cookers and instant pots made cooking them easier. But fatback remained obscure. Younger generations used bacon or ham hocks instead. But during the 1960s and 70s, skillet pinto beans with fatback were a practical one-pan meal that cost less than 50 cents and fed 4 people. The beans were creamy and filling, the fatback added richness, and the bean liquor, pot liquor, was served with cornbread to soak up every drop. Some people loved the simple earthy flavor. Others found beans too plain or too gas-producing. But for seniors living alone, Skillet Pinto beans with fatback remained practical. They cost almost nothing, lasted for days, and required 1 pan. But if beans felt too plain, what came next was simpler and used Bologna and eggs. Fried bologna and eggs wasn't breakfast. It was supper when bologna and eggs were the only things left in the icebox. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 10 minutes. Slice bologna thick, cut a slit in the center so it didn't curl, fry in a skillet until the edges crisped and browned, push the bologna aside, crack eggs directly into the same pan, fry until the whites set and the yolks stayed runny, or cook through if preferred. The smell was fried bologna and eggs. The taste was salty, smoky bologna, rich eggs, everything cooked in bologna grease. It cost about 50 cents in 1965, bologna from the package, eggs from the carton. This worked because bologna lasted a week in the icebox, eggs kept for weeks, and both cooked in 1 pan in under 10 minutes. No separate cooking, no butter needed. Bologna had enough fat, just slice, fry, crack, done. Some families served it with toast or fried potatoes on the side, but plain bologna and eggs was a complete meal. The runny yolks mixed with the crispy bologna edges, creating a rich sauce. The meal stayed common through the 1980s when bologna and eggs were considered working-class comfort food. Truck drivers ate it at roadside diners. Factory workers packed it for lunch. Children ate it for dinner when parents worked late. It was fast, cheap, and filling. Everything you needed when time and money were tight. By the 1990s, health concerns about processed meats and cholesterol made bologna and eggs less popular. Younger generations preferred turkey bacon or egg whites, but during the 1960s and 70s, fried bologna and eggs were a practical 1-pan meal that cost 50 cents and cooked in 10 minutes. The bologna curled into cup shapes if you didn't cut slits, which some people loved because it held the runny yolks. Others preferred flat bologna that crisped evenly. The key was frying the bologna until the edges browned and crisped. Soft bologna was unappetizing and rubbery. Some people added cheese on top of the eggs, or sprinkled black pepper, or splashed hot sauce. But plain fried bologna and eggs with salt was the classic version, simple, salty, and satisfying. But if bologna felt too processed, what came next was simpler. Skillet potatoes and onions in bacon fat wasn't a side dish. It was supper when potatoes, onions, and leftover bacon grease were all you had. Seniors in the 1960s made this meal in under 30 minutes. Dice potatoes and onions, fry them together in hot bacon fat in a skillet, stir occasionally until the potatoes were golden and crispy, and the onions were soft and caramelized, season with salt and pepper. The smell was fried potatoes and sweet onions. The taste was rich. Crispy potatoes, caramelized onions, smoky bacon flavor throughout. It cost about 30 cents in 1965. Potatoes from the bin, onions from the crisper, bacon fat saved from breakfast. This worked because potatoes kept for weeks, onions lasted forever, and bacon fat was free, saved in a can by the stove and never thrown away. No separate pots, no butter or oil needed, just dice, fry, season. Some families added peppers or garlic or cracked eggs on top at the end, but plain potatoes and onions was more common. The meal stayed wildly popular through the 1990s as home fry or fried potatoes at diners and home kitchens. It was served for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on what else you had. Add eggs, and it became breakfast. Add sausage, and it became dinner. Eat it plain, and it was a side dish. The versatility made it a staple in households that needed to stretch ingredients. By the 2000s, health concerns about saturated fat made bacon grease less popular, and vegetable oil or olive oil replaced it in most kitchens. Younger generations found the idea of saving bacon grease old-fashioned or unhealthy. But during the 1960s and 70s, skillet potatoes and onions in bacon fat were a practical one-pan meal that cost less than 50 cents and required no thought, just whatever vegetables were left and whatever fat was saved. The potatoes had to be diced small enough to cook through, but large enough to stay crispy. The onions added sweetness that balanced the salty bacon fat. Some people loved the smoky richness. Others found it too greasy. But for seniors living alone, skillet potatoes and onions in bacon fat remained practical. It used leftovers, cost almost nothing, and required one pan and one spatula. It was the simplest one-pan meal, 30 one-pan meals that kept families fed when washing dishes felt impossible. Fried chicken with potatoes, ground beef and cabbage, liver with onions, catfish and bacon grease. None of it was fancy. It was what you made when one skillet was all you had, and the sink was already full. Your grandmother fried everything together, made gravy from the drippings, and called it supper. She didn't apologize for using bacon fat or frying Bologna. She just cooked. But what happened when she had no skillet at all? When even frying felt too hard? When the stove stayed cold and supper came straight from the icebox?